Colonel Keith Watts is the Director of Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance at Headquarters Air Force Space Command, Peterson Air Force Base, Colorado. Major Justin Banez, who is the Assistant Director of Operations, 14th Air Support Operations Squadron, Pope Army Airfield, North Carolina, where he serves as a Joint Terminal Attack Controller and Air Liaison Officer. Captain Christopher Jewell is the Executive Officer to the Director of Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance, Headquarters Air Force Space Command, Peterson Air Force Base, Colorado. First Lieutenant Felicia Racine is the Operations Officer, 23rd Security Forces Squadron, Moody Air Force Base, Georgia. Let's give them all a hand. Let's begin today's session by asking each of the panel members to share a story in which you demonstrated or saw someone else demonstrate professional commitment.
Okay, so I'm going to start off as the youngest panel member here. I think to tell my brief story about where I've seen some professional commitment, I just want to give you a little bit of background about what I did in Afghanistan. I was the sector commander for the largest pedestrian ECP in CENTCOM, and we were responsible for processing 10,000 local nationals, 10,000 Afghans a day through the entry control point to make sure that they're not bringing anything that they shouldn't be onto base. And while there, I had 11 towers and 7 miles of perimeter that we were defending. And luckily, I was a small sector, so a lot of times when we got attacked, it happened, you know, on the flight line or outside of my sector. But one particular time, we got attacked, and unfortunately 2 people were killed, and my guys were the first on scene, and they were the ones that were initially trying to provide CLS to the individuals, and it amazed me. This was kind of like my eye-opening experience there. I was, you know, a young butter bar, and I really hadn't even been in the military for a year yet. And this was my first experience where I was like, wow, you know, I'm at war right now. And my troops, you know, after it was all said and done, they didn't get that chance to de-wind. They had to go right back into you know, their fighting positions. They had to go do their perimeter response duties and all sorts of stuff. And it amazed me the commitment that they showed that day, that they were committed into doing their job and continuing to do what they needed to do even after seeing such a horrible atrocity. And Chief Cody touched on it in the opening ceremony that, you know, you're going to get to see your airmen do amazing things, and that's definitely one of those moments that I think I'll probably always remember, that I got to see my airmen doing amazing things that day, and it continued on throughout the deployment.
All right, good morning. My background, being an intelligence officer, is very ground and soft-centric focused. I've deployed to Iraq twice, Afghanistan, assisted with the relief effort in Haiti, and soft operations in Libya, and a few other things. So when I look back on all my experiences, I actually think back to one of my first deployments when I was with Major Banez. We were deployed together in southern Iraq. Towards the end of our deployment, there was one incident where a vehicle had an IED incident, and the individuals were okay, and they brought the vehicle back off of the patrol, and you could see shrapnel had kind of hurt the vehicle a little bit. And at the time, I kind of disagreed with the order, but the commander told those individuals to get back out there. It was John Farr's vehicle, remember that? Yeah. And these guys just kind of saluted sharply and pressed back on and went back outside the wire to continue their mission of IED route clearance. So it was something that, you know, they had already just seen a very traumatic incident, but said, you know, we're going to continue to press on to keep those roads safe for the population of Iraq and other coalition forces in the area. So that's something that I always kind of look back on and say, you know, if I've ever had a bad day or something, look at these guys driving on and continuing the mission.
Thank you, Chris. And good morning, everyone. I was actually deployed to Afghanistan again recently, about the same time that Lieutenant Racine was there, and I was supporting a special task force that was supporting IJC, the Joint Command Downrange. It was only a battalion-size element, but our focus was as the theater response force, and we helped a lot with a lot of retrograde operations throughout this past year as we were winding down with Enduring Freedom. And my team, I had 7 JTACs total, including myself, supporting this battalion. And we went on kind of standard 6-month orders, but the battalion that we were supporting had open-ended orders. They didn't know exactly how long they would be. I mean, they actually cut 12-month orders just in case they were going to be there and potentially longer. And as things kind of started to ramp up, and a lot of folks didn't realize this, there were still a lot of things happening in southern Afghanistan. When it was time for my guys to leave officially, they didn't want to go. And I had to send a couple guys back in order to continue some of their own professional development type stuff back here in the rear. But most of my team, without me even asking, volunteered to stay to the very end to continue supporting their brothers in arms. We were supporting about 800 paratroopers with the 82nd Airborne Division. And so we stayed an extra 3 months to see it to the end.
Hi, I'm Keith Watts, and I'm officially on the far left of the table here as the old guy on the panel. And I really want to be able to kind of bring a different perspective to this in terms of, I walked through these doors at the Air Force Academy in 1986. President Reagan was still in the Oval Office, and the idea of professional commitment and what that would mean was radically different back then than it has been in a post-9/11 era. And kind of what we thought we were getting into as a service and as a nation back then is just very different than the state of affairs we're in today. But as to what I've seen across my career in terms of professional commitment, I have a much harder time thinking of times when I haven't seen it than when I have. The example I talked about yesterday in the discussion was watching a friend of mine who was deployed with me in Iraq. We were working detainee operations, who was only going to be there for a couple of weeks, was flying in to add support and leaving. And because he knew he was only going to be there for a couple of weeks, I watched, I think for the last 3 or 4 days straight, he just didn't sleep. He refused to quit. He refused to give up on the task that we were trying to do, which was follow a chain of people to try to catch Al-Qaeda in Iraq at the time. It was 2006 era. And the trail we were on was that of AMZ. And he literally didn't sleep. Turns out it's like you're drunk if you don't sleep for 3 days. But despite that, would not stop. And so that's an example of commitment. The other example that I think of is kind of using the same. You've heard of drones. Everyone has, and what they do. And it's one thing to have hundreds of people in a dark room in a vault working when no one knows what they're doing, and they're supporting a war in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in Sudan or over Yemen or over Africa, who spend hours mentally in a war zone and then go home to sort of the mundane daily life of just, taking care of the household and dishes and mowing the grass and things like that, or shoveling snow, as the case may be. There's commitment in that. The example I really wanted to kind of highlight today, though, is one that I just, as listening to them talk, it's a harder example of when it's hard to carry on. And I worked at NSA Georgia, where I had linguists that do a job there. And we had a linguist who was able to basically get warning of an impending terrorist attack, of an explosive device that had been implanted, and put out the warning like they should. It's a senior airman, puts out the warning to the field. A bunch of forces rushed there to dismantle the bomb. And it turns out that was all a well-calculated ambush, that in fact the warning was designed to get responding forces there so that they could assault. The responding force had several members killed. And the example of commitment in this case was, the senior airman was devastated. They felt like they had led U.S. forces into an ambush, led them into a trap. And yet you've got, this person basically had to somehow find a way to continue to do that same type of work day in, day out, without recognition, without fanfare, in a vault where no one knows what they're doing. But that's the type of anguish that they're trying to work through, and the personal guilt that they have to deal with. So I think it takes a lot of forms. There's the more obvious direct battlefield things, and then there's those enduring guilt situations that you have to work through to continue to do that job day in, day out. So I think it takes all forms, and and I think I've seen most of them. So.
Thank you for sharing those stories with us. We'll now open the forum to questions from the audience. Sir.
I'll go ahead and start with that. It's a nice thing to have a peer here. Captain Dewey's is also a TACP officer, but he brings up a really good point, and it's one that we face in our particular trade, and I'll use it as an example, but you know, our job really only comes to fruition when we are downrange. So the rest of the time that we're back at home, it is spent training and doing a lot of integration with our joint partners, in particular the Army is where you'll find us. And again, it is a daily challenge for us, and what I think what I'm trying to focus on with a lot of our senior NCOs and any of our junior leaders, the younger officers, is learning to be creative and seeing the bigger picture. I think too often we try to focus again on just the tactical side of things and wanting to see the bomb blow up and everything. But while that's fun and all, you know, there's a lot more to what we do and how to grow. So I think what I've learned to do is, again, try to tie into, you know, kind of the grander picture, and I think just continue to remind ourselves that, you know, at any given time, there can be a conflict that kicks off. So while we may be in this mode right now that things are slowing down, I have to constantly remind the airmen that at any given moment, you know, the call can come up for you to go forward, and you need to be ready for that. So any bit of training that we do, even if it seems to be mundane, has value, and I think we as leaders need to continue to push that. And you know, we just need to be better at how we vary, you know, what it is that we accomplish out there. So.
I kind of had this conversation with a few people, and sometimes Colonel Watts in particular, how when I entered the Air Force, I kind of came up in the generation of I'm ready for revenge. You know, 9/11 happened on 2001. I'm ready to go out there, sign me up. I mean, I was one signature away, actually, 2 weeks after 9/11 happened, from actually enlisting in the Marines, and decided to stick it out in ROTC and continue on. But when 2005 came along, I graduated and I entered the Air Force, and then I'm going through and I'm ready. I'm just constantly asking, when am I going to deploy? When am I going to get downrange? And I had to be told to wait, and that was the toughest lesson for me right then and there, was to wait, and I didn't understand why. And people were constantly, train yourself to do this, look at this, learn this, and for me, I became disgruntled, and I'm like, you got to be kidding me. You know, the war's going on, people are dying, and I'm not there to help. Then I deployed downrange, and I would say that was probably one of the toughest deployments I'd ever been on, the first one. And a lot of lessons learned. And when I came back from that, I kind of looked at it and went, that's not something I truly want to go through again. It kind of changed my mind a little bit, but at the same time, it was about being there for people and helping people. And so when I talk to young airmen today, you know, a lot of times sometimes when you have a stateside mission, it's just about training. It's just about, you know, learning. And I try and incorporate what I've learned in on that, is just, hey, your time will come. There will be a moment when you need to step up, and you got to be ready for that. And it's trying to get them to understand that at times they may not be ready, and for the older guys that have been through a deployment to kind of talk to the younger guys and say, you know, there's a time and place, you'll be there, and when you do, you'll do great things. But it's constant communication with the younger folks instead of just wait, we'll tell you when you need to go.
Yeah, I thought your question was a great one, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought it's not just about getting your units into that posture, but I was thinking personally about how I've had to kind of deal with that. The intelligence career field is one in which you don't necessarily have to be deployed to do a very direct, operationally relevant mission. And that over the years has been very satisfying to me personally and professionally, because you feel like you're making a difference. I just recently, as I mentioned, was at NSA Georgia. I moved from that to a major command staff, where I am now here at Peterson Air Force Base. And the contrast between what I was doing every day in my old job and what I'm doing now couldn't be starker. And so there's the sort of the personal, wow, I have to find that difference myself. But, I've done staff before. It's not that big a difference. But really, seeing a bunch of captains and majors and tech sergeants and master sergeants who are largely who's on these staffs, struggling with it in a way that they haven't spent 25 years doing more fun things and know that this is part of the process. You really do have to find a way to motivate and to paint a picture that makes sense, that gives meaning to the work, because it is important, or they wouldn't have put people in the jobs. It is a lot harder thing to do. And of course, we still have deployments that we send people on in our career field. It's a lot higher than the rest of the building. But organizing, training, and equipping a space force or a cyber force for the nation is just a little less direct than passing battlefield tippers to someone who's in a troops in contact situation. And so it is a hard thing to struggle with, and there's not an easy answer, but it's something you have to continually go back to and kind of make it clear to the airmen and civilians and folks that you're leading what it is they're doing, how their role fits, and why it's important regardless of how it seems relative to operations, quote unquote, because you can't do one without the other.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions? Sir?
All four of you are constantly Air Force officers. You probably wear a blue suit. You were well inculcated in what it means to be an airman. But when we fight our wars, we don't fight our wars just with the Air Force. We fight in joint organizations. We fight in coalition organizations. Whole different set of challenges there, and you have to encounter all the time earnest young officers from the Army, Navy, and the Marines who are just as devout to their theories and their beliefs as you are about how to use military forces. How have each of you encountered that, and how have you dealt with this issue of joint and coalition operations?
Yeah, since I'm holding the mic, I'll start with that. I spent, my career path is fairly unusual. I spent the year after I pinned on captain until I pinned on major in joint overseas organizations. The first 3 years was in Panama with Joint Special Operations, and talk about a different culture from the Air Force culture that I left to join that culture with. And then from there to a combatant command, UCOM, during the late 90s when we were at war with Kosovo. And so I immediately appreciated just how different Air Force culture was from Army, Navy, Marine, and then add the special ops culture in there. And it's one that if I had to give it a single word, I would describe that as more of a meritocracy than a standard military structure. Rank mattered less there. It mattered more about what you're bringing to the table. So that was a different flavor of jointness. My schooling has been for, squadron officer school in the Air Force, but I went to an Army Command and General Staff College and then National War College. And so all along the way, I think I've had the benefit really of being exposed to those other service cultures and to understand at the end of the day that cultures are different, but the fact that we're all good Americans fighting for the same cause is the same. And so what you have to do is, what I've found you have to do is sort of find that common ground. For us, it's get past the Air Force jokes about the golf course, or it used to be about our bike test for PT. Whatever it is, you kind of get past that, and when you bring value to the table, it's recognized. It just might take a little longer, depending on what service background you're coming from or what the biases are of the audience you're with. But at the end of the day, what I found is if you're committed to that goal, whatever the mission is that you've been tasked jointly to accomplish, that you'll get there. It's just sometimes frustrating. In fact, I would say joint is much easier than coalition. It's a lot more frustrating, I think, in a coalition environment because it's not just service culture, it's national cultures that you're dealing with. So NATO is hard.
All right, now I'll give my perspective on it. I live on an Army base, really. Well, there's still a bit of Air Force element to Pope, I guess, but for the most part, Fort Bragg is 50,000 strong, paratroopers. But I guess I've been kind of lucky since graduating from the Air Force Academy back in '04 and to this point now of being in an environment where jointness happened. And what I found is there was a lot of young officers from all the services, and it's not just the officers, the NCOs as well, that found themselves in the presence of other service members. And everyone's trying to work towards a common goal. And while you may have your background, your schooling, your doctrine, and then the Army's very, very rigid in adherence to their doctrine, but the reality is there were complex problems that we were all trying to deal with. And while there were a few people who didn't want to play, for the most part, I found that everyone kind of put their service, didn't matter what color your uniform was, they put that aside and tried to come together, collaborate, and figure out how we could bring, our various, resources to bear. And I've had the opportunity to work with Marines. I've had the opportunity, I got my master's degree at the Naval Postgraduate School and got to be a part of some of their innovations, and that was really neat. And then, now I work hand in hand with the Army. So I think the environment has allowed us to kind of get over some of the challenges that we may have seen in the past with service culture. I mean, we want to maintain that all the time, but I think what you're seeing now, and even at the cadet level, is the opportunity to interact with folks from different services and hopefully other nations to kind of work towards a common goal. And you just got to make sure you bring to the table, what your service represents and what air power for us. I mean, that's an important thing, but everyone brings that to the table, and I think we can achieve common goals.
So on every one of my deployments or operations that I've been a part of, I've never been part of a sole Air Force unit. It's always been either in an Army in lieu of tasking, or it has always been working with other nations. But when I was in Afghanistan, I was thrown into a position that was normally reserved for an Air Force rated person, but it wasn't flying. It was they called it an ALO, and it was about arranging and packaging all the air support and assets that goes for an organization no longer exists. They called it ISAF SOF, or the International SOF. There was 11 different task forces, 8 different countries, and nobody had their toys. Everybody just wanted to get in the fight, so it was a job to go run around to the Army division and say, look, I need 2 Chinooks, I need an ISR line, I need this and that, I need 2 F-16s from you to go prosecute this mission for this particular task force. But the challenge, was, understanding whether it was the Polish TTPs, the Czech Republic's TTPs, or the British. You started having to kind of work with each one of those. So it didn't just go across the services. This now went international, and for me it was a struggle because not only was there a language barrier, but there was a barrier of how TTPs of each country kind of conflicted with each other. And it was my job to kind of resolve some of that. But you kind of, as they talked about, you kind of step up to the plate, you go there, and you kind of bring the Air Force element to it, and you just kind of add a piece to the pie, and that's the ultimate goal of just trying to achieve the objective for that day. So I think that I don't think that there's going to be an operation in the future, it's a personal opinion, that we're not going to be working with somebody from another service or another nation. And it's kind of fun to see the perspectives of those other services or nations, and there's a lot to be learned during that process.
So when I was deployed, what Colonel Watts said about the coalition forces, that's more challenging than working with our sister services, and he's absolutely right. I had a 235-member coalition force. Well, 50 were U.S. Air Force, the rest were from Nepal and Afghanistan. So that presented challenges, but what was unique is in the beginning, the Air Force owned all of the 5 sectors at Bagram, and we owned the near battle area. So it was nice. I mean, our security forces group commander was the one that could, make that call on whether we're going to be dropping a bomb in the near battle area or whatever. And about 2 months in, the Army came in. And of course, as the Air Force, everyone's like, great, now we're going to fall under TACON to the Army. and everything's going to change, and they're going to think their way is the best, and we're going to have to fix everything that we do. But it was the 382 that came in, and they were awesome. They were very open to what the Air Force had to say. We had been doing it. We had been defending that base for a long time, so they knew that we had the experience, and we were the one. They're coming in with fresh eyes, so they brought a lot of good things to the table, but we worked great together. And then the 101st came in, and it was a little bit more difficult because they are very different from the 382. The 382 was a little bit more open to what we had to say as the Air Force and doing things our way. And the 101st was more like we want to do things the Army way. And that was very difficult at first for us because obviously a lot of people in the Air Force think that their way is the right way, and it's harder to see what somebody else has to bring, even if it's the right way. And funny enough, I'm married to an Army officer, so it brings some great debates in my house. And just recently, a few weeks ago, I got in this. Well, it wasn't an argument, but it was a debate, and I think I won because I'm the wife. But, but I was telling my husband, I said, I don't understand the Army. You tell them that this is the best way to do something, and it probably is the best way to do it, but the Army's so set in their ways that they don't want to listen to you. And he goes, babe, the Air Force does the same thing. And I'm like, no, we listen. He's like, no, you don't. So I think it just depends on what service you're in. I think it's important as officers because, like the captain said, we're always going to be joint downrange. So I think it's important that we're open-minded when it comes to other services because while we have been doing it one way, maybe for 10 years, fresh eyes do bring fresh perspective, and that may be the better way to do it. And I hate that answer of it's because we've always done it that way. So get that out of your head and just listen to what other people have to say.
Follow-up question.
Yes, sir.
You're married to an Army guy.
Yes.
You've taken jointness to a whole different level.
Yeah. Yes.
But with that now comes a different kind of commitment. So you're a Moody, he's a Fort Stewart.
Yes, sir.
How do you make all this work?
So we're both Norwich grads, if anyone's familiar with Norwich University. So that's how we met. We had both already signed our contracts, so there was no talking him into switching over to the blue, unfortunately. So I will say it is difficult. It's very difficult. But I know there's probably people in this room that are married mill to mill, separate services, and the way we make it work, we see each other on the weekends when we're both stateside. It just so happened that he did a 9-month tour in Afghanistan, and I told my commander that I have to get an Afghan deployment because he can't have one up on me. I'm very competitive. And so I got the Afghan deployment, and I left 2 weeks after he got home. So, but he didn't have one up on me anymore, so it's kind of worth it. It's very difficult, and if anyone, if any of the cadets are engaged to be married, and it just so happens that they have, they're going to marry somebody in a different service, it's definitely difficult, but you can make it work. Not everything is permanent. I've been at Moody for 3 years, and maybe my next station we'll be stationed together. But I love the military. I was a military brat, so I wouldn't trade it for the world. So.
Does anybody have any more questions for the panel?
Sorry, this question is for the whole panel. Steve Wunsiak, Steve 34. So we have cadets about to graduate from my class of 90 days or a year, and so looking back at your careers, although it might be short or very long, what's one piece of advice you're willing to give us to kind of help us out once we get to the movie?
So I'll start. Sorry if you're sick of listening to me talk, but so same kind of question was asked yesterday, and I gave this story, and I'm going to give it again. One of the hardest things you do as an officer is self-reflect, and you never want to admit to yourself that you were wrong or that what you were doing is not the right way to do it. And when I first came in, you probably can tell just by talking to me for a little bit that I'm pretty outgoing, and I'm one of those people that I want everyone to like me in the room. And if they don't like me, I want to find out why, and I want to get them to like me. And so I was this young, bright second lieutenant coming into a security forces squadron, and I'm like, I'm going to get everybody to like me. And I did, but the problem with that was everyone thought we were friends. So all of my troops and I, we were buddies, not going to the bar and drinking together, but I was LT, but a friend, and I could talk to, they could talk to me however they wanted, not the flight commander, and when something came down to having to discipline them, I was the one doing it. So I learned the hard way. I had a staff sergeant that really, tested me. He was pretty disrespectful in front of some first-term airmen. There's some A1Cs that were turning in their weapons at the armory, and I think I was just kind of in shock at the conversation that was occurring and what he was saying to me, but how was I supposed to say anything about it, because I let him talk to me however he wanted before, because I wanted everyone to like me and I wanted to be everyone's friend. And that's when I realized that I had made the one mistake that people always tell you, don't become friends with your troops, and I unfortunately made that mistake. So I had to backtrack and correct myself. I think the one piece of advice I would give is that you're not going to be everybody's friend, and it's your job as an officer to make decisions that not everybody's going to like. Hopefully the majority likes that decision. 90% of the people probably will agree with you, and if they respect you, it doesn't matter if they like the decision you make, they respect you, so they're going to support it. And it's just, the takeaway is that you're always going to have somebody that doesn't like what you have to say or what decision you are making, and it doesn't matter. You got to make it. That's what you're paid to do. So don't be the popular guy. Be the guy that's doing the right thing.
All right, so like she said, this question was kind of asked yesterday, and my response to it I thought about it a little more last night, and it kind of comes in three things if I could go back and talk to myself or young people. First thing to me was attitude. I had a bad attitude when I walked in the Air Force. It was horrible. I mean, I angry, I'd punch holes in the wall, I'd throw chairs, and that was all because I lost a game at Battlefield 2 or something like that, So, and I was out of Red Bulls. So, it was just my attitude walking in was, why can't I go do this? This is about me. I'm ready to go deploy, and my attitude just sucked. And what I found through my 10 years in the Air Force is that attitude is a lot. Whether you walk into an organization the first day, to how you conduct yourself when you have a bad day, how you're dealing with people, your attitude feeds and reflects on everything. And so what I found is if I come in with a positive attitude, people are going to feed off of that and generally be more responsive, and we can have a more open dialogue, versus if I just came in with a stern face and just told people what to do and just yelled, why wasn't this done? I feel that things just it wasn't a very good climate. Second thing is your time will come, is the second thing I could go back and tell myself. Is I was so ready to get out there. Now I look back on it and said, if I had deployed the day that I finished intel school, I would have been a mess downrange. It took time to learn the job before I went down. And then when the time did come, I had to tell myself, okay, now's the time to step up. And that may not be directly dropping bombs. It may not be directly employing air power. It might be being a maintainer, getting the aircraft genned up to go out and fight the mission. But your time will come. And so when it does, be ready. And the third thing is, remember, I tell myself, remember, Chris, you're a leader. This is why you join the officer ranks. So you're going out there to lead people. You're going out there and you're affecting lives. And sometimes I tell Colonel Watts, I say, I don't care what I do next. If you tell me to go lead a janitor staff all the way to a 400-person squadron, I'll be happy because I signed up to lead. And I think that's kind of the three things that I would go back and tell myself or new people entering the Air Force.
That's a great question, Cadet Acosta. My first one to you and to everyone in here is to be bold. Be a bold leader. Don't confuse that with being arrogant or being cocky. I mean, You know, we're not necessarily entitled to a lot of things. But I've been impressed by the cadets I've met here. I had the pleasure of actually being out here in Colorado about a week ago and got to meet some cadets that are about to graduate and some that are up and coming. And again, it's very impressive, you know, the quality of people that we have in this nation and certainly this institution. But you owe it to, you know, future commanders, current commanders, to be someone that is outspoken, not in a bad way, but sometimes we get caught up in our ways. Sometimes we have narrow views, okay? But you guys you're so much more connected to the world right now, and you have a lot to offer. So do not be afraid to step up. And then when the challenges really do come, you know, and I've faced many this past year in Afghanistan in a very politically driven climate, you know, on how we do our job. Sometimes you got to put your neck out there, okay, and keep focused on what the mission is and the fact there are people still, you know, fellow Americans that are out there at risk. So be bold. You'll know when the time is, but just always remember that. Second one is to be humble. Oftentimes, and I tell this, Chris is a very good friend of mine, and I've known him for a long time, but one thing I've talked about often is I have to humble myself before someone else does it for me. And I say, yeah, exactly. A lot of folks know what I'm talking about there. And you know, part of that was passed on from my family and all that. They did a very good job of that. My father was an MTI for like 12 years. So, yeah, you know, I was used to being humbled. But you know, I grew from that, and I just realized that, hey, you know, a lot of good things are going to happen to you in your career, and regardless of whether you're in the Air Force, or you work in the civilian sector. But sometimes you have to step back and think about all the things that, you know, that are being given to you and presented to you. You know, you may have a very big role in that, but, you know, it's coming from other folks too. So remind yourself of that, and, you know, and pass that on to your peers, your subordinates, and sometimes even your leaders. And then the last thing that I want to put on, and we didn't discuss it really yesterday too much, but is to cultivate relationships. In this very short period of time, it's been awesome being amongst these three right here. I've known this dude for a long time, but, you know, on the professional side and certainly as a friend, and what I challenge all of you to do is to do the exact same thing. You know, you guys are going to leave here from this institution. Don't let those bonds just dissolve. You know, strengthen those and then create more. That's the only way we're going to advance. It's the only way we're going to be effective, you know, and actually serve this nation, is if we, you know, again, push aside our personal differences and try to work with each other.
I think so far those have been exceptionally good answers, and I agree with everything that they've said. I'll add a slightly different perspective just to add to the conversation, I think. And that is especially for those of you who have just been told what your career field is going to be, and you're going to go out to a tech school or pilot training. You've got a new AFSC, a career field. You're going to be exceptionally focused and driven to do well, I assume, in those occupations and those fields as leaders and as airmen. And what I'd caution is that as I've looked back at my own career, and as I've had the chance to sit down with many young first assignment officers and airmen in my last couple jobs, is that there is an ease with which you can focus on that job to the exclusion of sort of the bigger picture. At a cryptologic site where you're doing cool things that's leading to protecting coalition forces and killing Taliban every day, that's a fun job. And you can forget that there are other jobs in that career field that also need love and need support. And so where you are in that first assignment is just the first step on a long journey that you're making. It's not the Air Force, it's not the totality of it, it's just your first job. And there are many, many different experiences as you move through those different jobs. I think if I had been allowed to stay on the first or second job that I had, I would have happily done it. I'm very thankful that I was not allowed to do that. And so, in a word, I would say that you need to have some patience with the process. You're going to learn a lot. take what you learn in those jobs and apply them to the next job, because I found that there's something from every place that you go that's applicable everywhere else you go. Your challenge is to figure that out. So in addition to patience, though, I think you have to have some trust. You have to have trust in your leadership, and you have to have trust in it's hard to say, trust in the assignment process, because it can seem random, it can seem vague, mysterious, all sorts of things, frustrating. And every one of us who's had more than one assignment can attest to all those attributes of the assignment system. One of the privileges I have in my current job is to be a member of the developmental team for the intelligence career field, where I'll go and sit down with my peers, and we'll review the careers and the records of eventually, everyone who's going to be a commander or an operations officer, et cetera. And what I can tell you is there is passion and commitment. And part of the reason I still am in the Air Force is because I feel so strongly about that role. And so you might not understand what's happened to you or why, but there has to be at least an element of trust that there is someone looking out for you who you've never met and you may have never heard of or may never meet again in your career, but who is trying their best to develop you in a way that you might not yet have the patience or vision to see, but that hopefully if you stick around and stick through your career, you'll be able to capitalize on. So, 2 words, trust and patience, is what I'd add to what they've said.
Thank you. Sir.
So this is going to be kind of like a two-part question. So a lot of officers and enlisted people will agree that probably one of the most important traits as an officer is to take care of your people. And I hear that a lot, take care of your people, that's the most important quality. So I don't know if this might be a sort of weird thing to ask, but I don't think anyone's ever asked, how exactly do you take care of your people? Like, what do you do? Like, everyone always says take care of your people, but, I'm not really sure, like, how you go about doing that. And the second part is, you all kind of harped on, maintaining a relationship with people, whether it be officers or troops and whatnot. So what's kind of like the dividing line between, having that person like you, as you were saying earlier, but still maintaining a professional relationship without being that guy, without being that person that everyone's kind of like, oh, this guy's, a real stickler, you shouldn't, he should be someone new.
I think that's an exceptionally good question. And we could probably, every one of us, talk for the rest of the panel about just that topic. I'd say there's a macro level of taking care of people. If you're commanding an organization, you're setting a vision, you're providing resources and making sure that people know what they need to be doing, and you're creating an environment. So that there's that level of it. But what I feel is a much more powerful way of taking care of people is knowing individuals well enough to be able to take on helping them where they need their help. And I'll use an example that was someone taking care of me. In the way, Lieutenant General Otto is the Headquarters Air Force Director of Intelligence. We were facing in our career field for colonels an early selective retirement board, where you're invited to leave the Air Force sooner than you perhaps planned. Early promotion to civilian. So General Otto took it upon himself to send out an email to everyone who is affected by that board. He crafted each email differently depending on how he viewed your career. Fortunately, I got a version of the email that said, I don't think you have much to worry about. And it was a BCC list, so you couldn't see who he sent it to. But I really appreciated getting the email because I was not sure I was necessarily in that category. I have friends of mine, close friends, who got a different version of that email, which is, if this board meets, I'm afraid that despite your good service that you might not make it through this process, and perhaps it's time to think of some other things. And I had the opportunity this fall, and as it happened, our career field was so short we didn't actually meet the board. But I had I sent him a thank you note when he sent the email. I just said, thanks, sir. I understand the ambiguities associated with this, but good to know that I might be safe. And he wrote back an email, and I think I kept it, but it basically said, thanks, Keith, and we really need you. And the really need you part of it was important. And he indicated that I was going to be coming here to Air Force Space Command. But what he really did was, in that email, prevented me from retiring. Because I was about to, I think. And so I had the chance this fall to thank him for that. My wife and I talked about, whether we want to roll the dice again, and we thought Colorado Springs would be fun, and it has been. It's been exceptionally good. But I had a chance to thank him this fall. And his response to me, I think, was telling, and I think it gets to the essence of how do you take care of people. He said, Keith, it was my pleasure, and he said, we take care of airmen, one airman at a time. And to me, that was a pretty powerful message. To do that, you got to know your airmen. And so that's how I'd approach it, or how I have approached it.
Yeah, and I don't like to piggyback necessarily, but that is, I think that is the right answer. Because when I was a second lieutenant, I got thrown out there, and I became a flight commander very quickly, and I had 50 to 70 people, and I think Lieutenant Racine had the same thing, or has experienced that even more recently. And it's like, well, what do I know? I mean, I remember my cadet experiences and what kind of worked, what maybe didn't work. But you're about to face this, well, at least some of the firsties, you guys are about to face this really soon. And I guess on a whim, and also with some good mentorship from my first flight sergeant, was doing exactly what the colonel just talked about, which is taking the time to know each of those individuals. What I talked about with the group yesterday is that you can't apply a blanket approach to your people to get things done, or you just can't apply a blanket approach. Some people react differently, and you don't know what you don't know in their daily lives. Folks show up to work, but you don't know what kind of issues they're dealing with at home. They don't know what kind of issues you're dealing with at home. I mean, you're a person too. But what I found often, because I had brand new airmen to master sergeants in my flight, and then eventually as an operations officer, the same kind of construct was, again, just taking that time out of my day. It didn't matter what else was going on, to just listen. Again, going back to that humble piece of things. And oftentimes, people just want to know if you're there for them. And what I found is some people just needed time to go and take care of whatever issue they had, and maybe you just had a crazy schedule for them, and it wasn't allowing for that. Other people actually needed you to interject and maybe, establish some relationships, get them in touch with the right organization or people to help address the problem they had. Didn't necessarily need you to do it. I mean, guys didn't need me to take care of, like, for example, folks that had marital issues. I wasn't married, I'm still not married, but regardless of, they didn't want the LT to take care of that. They just wanted someone to help facilitate that, and I was in a position to do that. So you kind of have to take it, individually. You can't apply a blanket approach to it. It may seem like it adds more to your day, but that's what you're there for. So, and that's the measure of success for everybody.
So I'll piggyback off the piggyback there. Obviously, knowing their people, can't be said enough. So I'll take a little bit of a different approach to this. When I had my own people, I think the biggest thing I could do to help take care of them and develop a relationship was open and honest feedback. I'm not doing them any service, I'm not doing the Air Force any service, or our relationship, if I'm not telling you the good things and the not so great things and the things that you can improve. Because then if I try and say and sugarcoat it and say everything's great, and then I come down on them one day, they're looking at me going, well, why did you do that? If I haven't given them the chance to rectify a certain situation. So I think there's that. And the second example is when I was deployed with Major Banez, I was in a very unique situation, being an intel officer as part of a cop squadron that was downrange, doing all the outside the wire operations. I did all their, I was probably one of their last faces before they left the wire, one of the first faces that they saw coming back in, because I was right there saying, okay, let's debrief, or I might go out on patrol with them. But I began to know these individuals, and I wasn't their direct leadership chain. I was kind of I was an officer, but I was off to the side. And so what I would do is I began to sit down and I would talk to them. I would learn who their girlfriends, wives, husbands, boyfriends, children's names, things like that, just small things they just wanted to talk about, because they felt like, well, I can talk to you, but you're not my leadership. So there isn't somewhat of an awkward feeling, because sometimes, let's be honest, I mean, if it's a colonel walks in the room, you might act a little bit different than if it's just somebody of a younger rank. And so I would just sit down and chew the fat with them. And what I developed was a relationship with them, and I began to understand them. And if I noticed a trend with problems or their situation, I might be able to, at the time, I was Lieutenant Banez and I was Lieutenant Jewell, and I'd say, hey, Justin, I think somebody's got a problem in your flight. I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but it's just kind of what I heard. And so being in a leadership position like that and being able to give feedback to another leader to say, hey, I'm noticing something is invaluable, because now that leader can go and address it and foster that relationship within their chain. So I just noticed that taking care of your people doesn't always have to be your people. It can be other people's people. It's just about being a leader and communicating with those individuals across the Air Force.
One way that I've personally strived to take care of my people, I never let my airmen outwork me. And what I mean by that is it's no secret that cops usually have some of the crappiest hours out of anybody. I think maybe maintainers beat us a little bit, but cops have some pretty crappy hours. And in the work that we do, sometimes it's hard to see the big impact, and that's my job as a leader, to make sure that my airmen do see that. But downrange, my troops were working 6 and 1, 12-hour shifts, and they were exhausted. And there's no reason as a leader that you should be working less hours than they are. And there's going to be a time where you're just physically and emotionally, mentally exhausted, but just think they probably are too. A lot of your airmen that you're downrange with are 18 years old, 19 years old, and it's their first time away from mom and dad, or the first time away from their family. And we went to college, so it's not our first time away from our mom and dad. While we do struggle being away from our families, and it doesn't make it any easier, everyone has their what's going to affect them while they're downrange, and what makes it tough for them. So I wanted to make sure that my troops realized that, I thought it was important to work as hard as they do. And then I think they answered your question pretty much really well. So just to add to the conversation, the worst thing you can do as a leader is be a toxic leader. And I'm sure all of the seasoned active duty people and reserves in here have heard the toxic leadership conversation come up, but I was telling them last night, I worked for a toxic leader, and I'll tell you what happens when you're that person. Your people, they no longer tell you what the problems are, because they don't want you to spin up about them. So if you're one of those people that is constantly just freaking out every time something happens, something small, but something happens, your people are going to start trying to hide that from you. They're no longer going to want to tell you, hey, we wrecked into the barrier outside. They're going to try to fix it and probably make things worse, but they're going to try to fix it before you even know about it, because they know that you're going to freak out. And toxic leadership it'll bring a squadron to its knees. And we started to see that a little bit downrange with one of our leaders, and the people no longer wanted to work for that individual, because that person was just not a good person to work for. He wasn't a good leader, and it was difficult for us to do our job. We were micromanaged, and then you just saw morale just go way down. And thankfully, I had an outstanding commander, and he recognized that, and he brought that leader in, and he addressed it to him, and he told him what the issue was, and it seemed to clear it up a little bit. But that would be my advice. Don't be a toxic leader, and listen to your people.
Thank you.
Major, you mentioned that you deployed in some politically driven climates. My question is, how has politics affected your job, made it more difficult, and how do you deal with that?
No, that's a great question. And to kind of clarify what I mean with that is, what is our posture downrange? When you're still sending people into the thick of things, but that once you get there, you hear a totally different story from some of the senior leaders that conflicts. To be honest, again, it goes back to what I said earlier about being bold, is oftentimes there's a disconnect, just depending on where you are positionally. And I even face that even at a squadron level. You know, you just don't know exactly everything that's going on at the lower level, and you have to make a concerted effort to be connected to that. But you know, in those circumstances, again, you know, remember we still have a chain of command that you follow, and you have to tread that line very carefully. And again, you're still executing the orders of, you know, those appointed over you. But at the same time, I think the challenge for me personally was to bring everything to the table and say, you know, sir, ma'am, whoever it is, this is what is really happening down here, and I want you to see this before we let kind of a baseline decision be made, because we are potentially putting other people at risk. I mean, lives at risk. And then that was the kind of the situation that I had to deal with was, you know, we were supporting an element that was still going forward, whereas everyone else thought that there's no ground, you know, there's no ground combat operations, everything's being done from, you know, inside the wire. Well, that was not the case, at least not for our task force. And so we brought a certain capability that was approved at a higher level, and it's just, you know, again, understand where we are and what the environment is, but again, we bring something that might help mitigate potential losses. In the end, it all did work out, and we did exactly that. But in circumstance, that's obviously a combat-related type of thing. You'll find that in other environments. I mean, you'll deal with that just even back at home station, where there'll just be a conflict of interests. And again, you owe it to your people and you owe it to your boss to just be as transparent and open with you know, what the circumstances are. Sir?
Yeah, let me add to that somewhat. First, I'd say I think it's a mistake to think that you could ever be in a deployed environment that doesn't have a political component to it, because you can't get there without the civilian leadership, which cannot be divorced from politics. And I think I've seen over my career, and I was one of them, that the military, we want to go do things. We want to get things done. We want to do it in the most effective, efficient way, and we want to get the mission accomplished. And I think in the context that you raised the question, politics would have been a four-letter word, because it would have been put in juxtaposition to that efficiency of trying to get stuff done the way we thought was the most effective in terms of getting an outcome. One of the things that I was forced to do, and I've gotten a master's in national security strategy, and one of the things that program did for me was, unlike other military professional development things, it actually made us study the political side. Sort of intermediate levels, you'll study, you know, Jomini or Clausewitz or, you know, military operations, military effective things, but you don't tend to do it in the context of a political environment. You'd like to think it could be separate. The reality is that it's not and never will be, and the only way it would be is if we somehow broke our government and became a dictatorship of some sort of military nature, and that would be tragic. And so what you have to do, I think, is kind of look at it from the totality of it and to understand it's always going to be there. And kind of, you have an obligation, I think, to raise issues like, are we sure we want to do this? But for example, in Afghanistan, when the Air Force was told you can no longer drop bombs because every time we do, we risk killing civilians, and in the bigger scheme, any single civilian in Afghanistan killed is more damaging to our national security strategy on the whole than any military objective would be. Therefore, I don't care how powerful air power is, you're not going to be allowed to use it. If you're a pilot that was about to go take off, that's going to be an exceptionally frustrating thing to hear because you know what you can do. You can go save troops and contacts' lives. But the national perspective is, yeah, but you might kill an Afghan, and in what we're trying to accomplish between our government and their government, that is a detriment that we can't allow to have happen. So I think it's a fact of life.
Thank you, sir.
So my background is an H-60 pilot, former
Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for one more question.
Tough question. Good question. Tough question. Yes, security forces is very male-dominated. When I was downrange, I was the only female leadership in my whole squadron. So that did present challenges. It was already a challenge that I was the only butter bar and everyone else was a captain or higher. So that automatically presents challenges. But being a female, you know, I have to say, I think we've come a long way in the military. I said I was a military brat, and it wasn't my dad that was it. He spent 4 years in, but it was my mom. She got out as a senior master sergeant, so she was very successful in her career. And I have to tell you, you know, she's my go-to person. I always ask her for advice, and I'm always talking to her. And if, you know, I'm upset about something, you know, I'm getting what she has to say. And I have to tell you that from the time that she was in and now, it's a different Air Force, and we've made a lot of progress. And I was nervous as a female going into a male-dominated career field because I was worried that you know, people weren't going to listen to me, that I wasn't going to have a voice because I was going to have some young males that were arrogant, because cops can be kind of arrogant. But I was going to have some young males that were arrogant and didn't care what I had to say and didn't care about my experience or anything. And I found that, you know, after they realized that I was going to take care of them and I was going to be there for them, and you know, after I got the respect, it really hasn't been an issue. Norwich is a military school, and that is also male-dominated. It's a 1:8 ratio males to females, so that definitely prepared me a little bit for that experience. But you know, I think if we had this conversation 15, 20 years ago, I'd probably have a completely different answer. But you know, people have been very receptive to me, not because I'm a female, but because, you know, my troops have come to respect me and appreciate what I have to bring to the table as their leader. So, my answer.
Thank you, ma'am. We actually have time for one more if anybody has another question. Sir?
So real quick, the chief of staff reading list just came out. One of the purposes of that is to help us maintain professional improvement. I'm wondering if you have any recommendations for the books or movies that can help you maintain professional improvement.
So on that reading list, the Men, the Mission, and Me is on there. And that is probably hands down one of the best books that you can read as a leader to gain some perspective on what it's like to be a leader in combat and then, you know, a leader in garrison. I would probably definitely recommend that, and then I'm sure most of you have probably already read Lone Survivor. But for me, I was a cadet when, you know, that became a very popular book, and I read it, and I didn't necessarily understand a lot of what the story is trying to tell. You know, I read it as a battlefield story. You know, there was a big battle, a lot of people died, and it was very courageous and sad, but a great book. And then, you know, I read it again after I went active duty, actually after I returned from deployment, and I kind of got a different perspective on it. But you learn a lot with that on the amazing things that people do, you know, your brothers and sisters in combat. And it's amazing that the relationships that are built when you're deployed, and it kind of goes back to what the major said earlier about keeping those relationships. But I think if you reread the book, if you've already read Lone Survivor, yes, there's a big battle in there, and that's the exciting part about the book, and that's probably what brings people to read it, but try to take a look at the relationship that those guys built, and it's not just SEALs that do that, it's every career field that builds those relationships, and you rely on each other, and it's really important. So look at it from a different perspective. That would be my recommendation.
I went to school in Georgia, so we don't read. No, there's a, when I first came into the intelligence career field, I was so focused on understanding this terrorist problem, this asymmetric warfare problem. That's where most of my readings have come from, that I've just, kind of focused on that. But there's a couple books out there that have kind of changed my, I didn't say changed my perspective, but gave me a little bit different insight, rather than just reading, this is how you fix the insurgency problem. Colin Powell has a book, and I think it was My American Dream is the name of it, if I'm right. And he has a lot of leadership lessons in there. I mean, just fantastic ones, from when he was a young officer all the way into the general officer ranks. And when you start reading his perspective on things, you begin to understand what a brilliant individual he is. The second book that Colonel Watts gave me when I was in his office one day, which I still have to return it, is one called On Killing, and it talks about the psychological impacts on killing and in warfare. And it just doesn't look at modern times. It goes back, and it talks about number of bullets fired versus number of people that were killed, why people chose to kill, why people didn't. And so it kind of brought that back to me, because as an intel guy, I'm not really going to be a trigger puller, but I will be a part of that chain somewhere down the line. And as you heard Colonel Watts with some of the examples, you will see the effects, good and bad, of what you do. When I was supporting the security forces downrange, some days I'd have a good day, because I'd be like, hey guys, I think there's an IED, I think it's in this location. They focus in, they find it, and I go right on. And then other days they come back and they get hurt. So it's just, I don't know, it's a lot of psychological things in that book that kind of brought back to me and my lessons in my life, going, yeah, okay, there's some correlation between this.
Good question, Brad, and you would ask that. Actually, one that I'm going back through now, and it's just one that I think an operations officer gave me a long time ago, and I don't remember who the author is, but it's just called Small Unit Leadership. And it's a very thin book, and it's very earthy in its language, but it's very useful, and I've been using it for the past couple of weeks, talking with my brand new lieutenants who just finished up the TACP school and are trying to figure out where do they fit into the organization, because we're a very tight one. They go through all the same training that their airmen go through, and just like the lieutenant had talked about earlier, it's very difficult trying not to be bros with them because they have a common experience. But at the same time, they're officers. There's an expectation for them to lead. But anyways, this book, it's not really a checklist, but it just talks about, it focuses more on the military aspect of things and very Army-like, but I think there's a lot of tried and true perspectives in there on how to take care of your people, like we were talking about earlier, and the sort of things that one needs to do to ensure the success of themselves and the people they're responsible for. I wish I had the name of the author to give to you all, but yeah, it's just called Small Unit Leadership, and it's just been around for, I think, maybe the past 30, 40 years, but the lessons still apply.
Thanks. I think it's a great question, and for a couple of reasons. One is, we'll give you some books, but frankly, I think reading anything is useful. For me, it's a form of reflection. And I've heard people, well, I don't have time to read a book. You do. If you have time to read an email or check your phone, you have time to read a book. And if you commute anywhere, you have time to listen to books on tape if you don't. Audible's awesome. I do mountain biking. I get through books by just listening to them while I'm riding through trails and forests and hitting trees and things. And so find a way to do it, because for me, the act of just seeking out interesting things to read and trying to take lessons from them has been really instrumental. A couple of books I'll point out that have shaped a lot of things. One was The Wisdom of Crowds by Surowiecki. It was basically about how group think can actually be useful in a lot of cases. But what I did with that book when I had read it was we were trying to form what combat crews should look like for ISR exploitation crews to support drones and U-2s and things. And I used a lot of what I found in that book to help shape that. Chip and Evan Heath they've written Made to Stick, Change, Decisive. There's a whole series of them. Every one of those I've taken something from and used it in my day-to-day life. I'll interweave nonfiction with fiction. I take things from those as well. So I think in a large sense, it really doesn't matter what you read, but read to allow you to reflect and take things from it and use it, and make time to do it because it's useful.
Yeah, just one little quick add-on from me. A little book that every enlisted force person in the Air Force gets is a little brown book called The Enlisted Force Structure. I keep one of those in my car, keep one of those at my desk, and I think it's one of the most perfect books out there because it really explains our enlisted force and what's expected of them. And I kind of look back and say, how are you supposed to be a leader and understand who you're supposed to lead if you don't know what is expected of them? So I read that all the time. I look back on what might be expected, and I look at that on reflection of myself. How should I be conducting myself as lieutenant, captain, major? And I kind of move through the ranks, and I go look at the different supervisory levels of the Airman, NCO, Senior NCO Corps. So I think it's a 362618 is, and if you can get one, great, and just keep it on you at all times.
Sorry, one last one, Captain Dewey, was Blunder. I don't remember who the author of it is, but it was he was one of my instructors at the Naval Postgraduate School. But the premise behind it is how, the propensity for like great leaders and well-intentioned leaders to still stumble and make mistakes. And I think that's a challenge for a lot of us here, because a lot of you already are great leaders, but sometimes you get so focused on that end state that how you try and get there might lead to not necessarily failure, but certainly run into some obstacles and some consequences you didn't intend. So, but yeah, the title of the book is called Blunder.
Well, thank you, Colonel Watts, Major Banez, Captain Jewell, and Lieutenant Racine for being part of our NCLS this year and for your outstanding service to our nation. We look forward to serving with you in the future.